thugs robbed a homeless beggar and mocked his dog, unaware it was Keanu Reeves. A cold wind howled through the darkened streets, rattling empty soda cans and pushing scraps of paper along the pavement. The city had long since gone to sleep, but for the homeless man, huddled beneath a tattered blanket, the night was just another battle against the bitter cold. His only source of warmth was a scruffy, golden-furred dog curled up beside him, its body pressed close to his for comfort. The man, known only as Old Joe to the few who paid him any mind, shivered and pulled his coat tighter around his frail body. Life had not been kind to him, but through all his hardships, his loyal companion, Duke, had never left his side. Footsteps echoed from the alleyway, heavy and deliberate. Laughter followed, the kind that carried arrogance, the kind that made the hairs on the back of Joe's neck stand up. He didn't need to look up to know trouble was coming. He had seen men like this before, young, reckless, desperate to prove their power over someone weaker. His fingers instinctively curled around the tin cup beside him. His meager collection of coins, barely enough for a meal, but it was all he had. "Look at this poor old man," one of them sneered, his voice laced with mockery. Another chuckled. "Think he'll share some of his fortune?" Joe didn't respond. Experience had taught him that silence was sometimes the best defense. But Duke, ever protective, let out a low growl, his sharp eyes watching the strangers with a quiet warning. "Oh, what do we have here?" The tallest of the group, a man with a jagged scar down his cheek, squatted down to Joe's level and tilted his head. "You think that mutt's gonna protect you?" Another one kicked at Duke. Not hard, but just enough to make him yelp and jump back. Joe reached for his dog, panic flashing in his tired eyes. "Leave him alone," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. The gang laughed, their shadows looming over him as one of them knocked over his cup, sending the coins clattering across the sidewalk. "Oops," the leader said with a smirk. "Looks like you lost your riches." Joe's heart clenched as he scrambled to gather what little he had. But rough hands grabbed his collar and yanked him back. He barely had time to react before a fist slammed into his gut, knocking the wind out of him. His vision blurred, pain rippling through his frail body. But his only concern was Duke. The dog barked furiously, lunging forward to defend his friend. But another one of the thugs stepped in, ready to strike him down, until a voice, calm yet carrying an undeniable force, cut through the night air. "Let him go!" The gang froze. Something about that voice sent an eerie chill down their spines. It wasn't loud, it wasn't aggressive, but it carried a weight that demanded obedience. The man who had been about to hit Duke hesitated, his hands still in the air. The leader, unwilling to be challenged, turned sharply towards the newcomer. "Who the hell are—" He stopped mid-sentence. His eyes widened, mouth opening slightly, as if his brain refused to process what he was seeing. Standing under the dim glow of the street lamp was a man dressed in simple clothes. Worn jeans, a black jacket, boots that had seen their fair share of miles. His dark hair fell just past his shoulders, slightly unkempt, and his beard gave him a rugged but unmistakable presence. But it wasn't his appearance that made the gang stumble back. It was his eyes. There was something about the way he looked at them, something calm yet unshakably firm, like a storm waiting to be unleashed, a presence so powerful, yet effortless, that it made their stomachs churn with unease. One of the younger thugs whispered, barely believing his own words, "No way!" The leader swallowed hard, suddenly recognizing the face that had been plastered. And across movie posters, action-packed fight sequences, and interviews that spoke of kindness, humility, and an almost unreal level of skill. Keanu Reeves. Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. The gang, who moments ago had been so full of cruel laughter, now stood frozen, their bravado crumbling under the weight of the moment. Joe, still gasping for breath, looked up, confused at first. His eyes traced the familiar features of the man standing before him, and even in his weakened state, a flicker of recognition sparked in his mind. Keanu Reeves, here, on this street. Duke, sensing the shift in the air, stood beside his master, his tail wagging slightly as he stared at the stranger. Unlike the gang, the dog showed no fear, only a curious, almost knowing gaze. The leader tried to recover, puffing out his chest, as if that could erase the sudden tremor in his hands. "So what?" he spat. "You think just because you're some famous actor, we're supposed to be scared?" Keanu tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "No," he said softly, "but you should be ashamed." His words struck deeper than any punch. The gang shifted uncomfortably, their confidence cracking. Then, before they could react, Keanu moved. It was subtle, barely more than a shift in his stance, but it sent a message loud and clear. Every single one of them had seen enough action movies to know when someone was trained. And Keanu wasn't just some Hollywood star pretending to fight. He had spent years mastering real combat techniques. The realization hit them like a freight. Train. The leader licked his lips nervously. "Come on, guys, let's get out of here." One by one, the gang backed away, their earlier bravado reduced to nothing. Within seconds, they had disappeared into the shadows, leaving behind only the sound of their hurried footsteps. For a long moment, there was only silence. Joe sat there, staring in disbelief, his hands still trembling. Duke wagged his tail and let out a happy bark, almost as if he understood that the danger had passed. Keanu crouched down, his expression softening as he reached out a hand to the old man. "Are you all right?" Joe blinked, his throat tightening with emotion. I think so." Keanu smiled slightly. "Good." Then glancing at Duke, he gave the dog a gentle scratch behind the ears. "He's a good dog." Joe nodded, tears brimming in his eyes. "He's my best friend." Keanu stood up, reaching into his jacket. A moment later, he pulled out something and pressed it into Joe's palm. Joe looked down, his eyes widening. It wasn't just money. It was more than enough to change his life. "Take care of yourself," Keanu said simply. And with that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the night as quietly as he had arrived. Joe sat there for a long time, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. The man who had saved him wasn't just an action hero on the big screen. He was real, and he had chosen to help a nobody like him. And as the city slowly woke up to a new day, the old beggar and his faithful dog sat in the same spot, but for the first time in years, Joe felt something he had long since forgotten. Hope. But the story wasn't over yet, because just days later, in a courtroom filled with tension, the thugs who had attacked him would come face to face with Keanu Reeves again, and this time, the entire room would gasp at what happened next. The courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the back rows, cameras flashing every few seconds. As murmurs rippled through the crowd, the tension was thick, hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. At the center of it all sat the three thugs, now cleaned up in cheap suits, their usual arrogance replaced with nervous fidgeting. They had been caught, and not just because of what they had done to old Joe. After their run-in with Keanu Reeves, their faces had gone viral. Security cameras from nearby shops had caught everything. The robbery, the threats, and most importantly, their cowardly retreat the moment they realized who they had messed with. And if the video alone wasn't enough, Keanu himself had stepped forward, making sure the authorities knew exactly what had happened that night. The charges against them ranged from assault to robbery, and as they sat waiting for the judge to enter, the weight of it all finally seemed to sink in. The leader of the gang, the one with the scar, tapped his fingers against the table, his leg bouncing up and down. "This is insane," he muttered under his breath. "It was just some old bum." One of the other guys shot him a look. "That old bum is the reason we're here, genius. Him and his stupid dog." Scarface clenched his jaw, his mind flashing back to that moment. The way the old man had cowered, the way the dog had snarled, and worst of all, the way Keanu Reeves had looked at them. That calm, piercing stare that had stripped them of all their false confidence in an instant. And now, here they were, sitting in court, waiting for their fate to be decided. The doors swung open and the judge entered. An older woman with sharp eyes and an air of authority that silenced the entire room. Everyone rose as she took her seat, and then, just as quickly, sat back down. She glanced over the case file, flipping through the pages with a practiced hand. "Case number 47B392, she said, her voice steady. "The people versus Travis Mills, Ryan Carter, and Daniel Brooks, charged with assault, robbery, and reckless endangerment." Travis, the leader, shifted uncomfortably in his chair as his name was read. Ryan and Daniel avoided looking at anyone, their faces pale. The prosecution wasted no time. The video evidence was played for the courtroom. The sound of their own laughter and cruel words echoing off the walls. The way they knocked over Joe's cup, the way they shoved him, the way Duke had yelped. It was all laid out in stark detail. But the moment that had the biggest impact was when Keanu stepped forward. He sat on the witness stand, calm as ever, but there was something different about him today. Something heavier. The entire courtroom seemed to lean forward as he spoke. "I've seen a lot of things in my life," he said, his voice steady, but filled with an undercurrent of emotion. "But that night, I saw something I can't ignore." The defense attorney stood, adjusting his tie. "Mr. Reeves, with all due respect, you're a famous actor. Why did you get involved in this situation?" Keanu's gaze never wavered. "Because it wasn't about me. It was about a man who was hurt, humiliated, and treated like he didn't matter. I couldn't just walk away." The defense lawyer nodded, but pressed further. "But the defendants didn't know who you were, did they?" Keanu let out a small breath. "No. They only cared about who they thought they could hurt, without consequence." Silence fell over the room. The words cut deeper than any legal argument. Old Joe was in the courtroom too, sitting in the front row with Duke at his feet. He looked different, cleaner, his beard neatly trimmed, his clothes no longer tattered. Thanks to Keanu's help, he had found a shelter, a warm place to sleep, and most importantly, a sense of dignity he hadn't felt in years. But as he sat there, watching the trial unfold, his hands still trembled slightly in his lap. He never expected justice, not for people like him. But as the trial continued, something remarkable happened. One by one, people came forward. A shop owner who had seen Joe around for years, who spoke of his kindness and how he never begged aggressively or caused trouble. A local woman who had often left food for Duke, who teared up as she described how the dog had always protected his owner. And then Keanu spoke again. "I've worked with some of the best stuntmen and martial artists in the world," he said, his voice carrying through the room. "I know what it looks like when someone is trying to hurt another person. That night, these men weren't just being reckless. They were being cruel." The defense attorney sighed, knowing there was little to argue. The evidence was overwhelming. The judge sat back in her chair, regarding the three men before her. This court doesn't take lightly to acts of violence against vulnerable individuals. It is the duty of society to protect those who cannot protect themselves. The thugs sat still, their faces pale as the weight of their actions bore down on them. They had assumed they were untouchable, that no one would care, but they had been wrong. And as the judge prepared to read her final verdict, the entire courtroom held its breath, waiting to see what fate awaited them. The judge adjusted her glasses and glanced at the three men sitting before her. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. Everyone was waiting for the final verdict, the moment that would decide if justice would be served. The three men who had once laughed at old Joe and mocked his dog now sat stiff and pale, their earlier arrogance drained away. She cleared her throat and began, her voice firm. Travis Mills, Ryan Carter, and Daniel Brooks, you have been found guilty of assault and robbery against an innocent man. This court does not tolerate acts of cruelty, especially against those who are vulnerable and unable to defend themselves. Travis shifted in his seat, his hands clenched into fists. Ryan swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the exit, as if considering an impossible escape. Daniel, the youngest of the three, lowered his head, his jaw tight. The judge continued, however, before I hand down my sentence, there is something I want you to understand. You didn't just take money from a homeless man that night. You took away his dignity. You treated him as if he were less than human. That is what makes this crime so appalling. A hush fell over the room. Old Joe sat quietly in the front row, Duke at his feet. His hands trembled slightly, but this time, not from fear. It was the weight of it all. The fact that for the first time in years, someone had stood up for him, that his suffering had not gone unseen. Keanu Reeves sat beside him, calm and composed, his presence still commanding despite his silence. He had done what he came to do. He had made sure the world saw the truth. The judge exhaled, closing the file in front of her. For your crimes, you are each sentenced to 2 years in state prison, along with 500 hours of community service upon release. You will be required to work with homeless outreach programs to understand the impact of your actions firsthand. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Some people thought the sentence was too harsh. Others thought it wasn't harsh enough. But for Joe, it wasn't about the punishment. It was about the fact that, for once, people like him mattered. The bailiffs approached the three men to take them into custody. Travis shot one last glare at Keanu before he was led away, but the actor didn't flinch. He simply watched, his expression unreadable. Daniel hesitated before standing. Unlike the others, there was something different in his eyes. Regret, maybe, even shame. Just before he was taken away, he turned toward Joe. I'm sorry, he muttered, barely above a whisper. Joe blinked, caught off guard. He didn't say anything, just gave a small nod. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something. As the courtroom emptied, Joe sat still, trying to process everything. The life he had lived, the years of being ignored, the way people walked past him as if he were invisible. And yet, in the span of just a few days, everything had changed. Keanu stood and patted Duke gently on the head before looking at Joe. You good? Joe let out a slow breath and nodded. Yeah, I think I am. Keanu gave him a small smile, then reached into his pocket. Here, he said, handing Joe a piece of paper. A friend of mine runs a place that helps people get back on their feet. They'll give you a place to stay, help you find work, if you're up for it. Joe stared at the paper, his throat tightening. For so long, he had convinced himself that this was his life, that there was no way out. But now, maybe, just maybe, there was hope. His eyes met Keanu's, filled with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. "Why are you doing all this?" he asked quietly. Keanu smiled, a soft, almost knowing look in his eyes. "Because someone once helped me when I needed it," he said. "And because the world could use a little more kindness." With that, Keanu gave him one last nod and walked away, disappearing through the courtroom doors, as if he had never been there at all. Joe sat there for a long time, Duke resting his head on his lap. He looked down at the paper in his hands, the weight of it heavier than he ever could have imagined. For the first time in years, the road ahead didn't seem so dark, and as he stood up and stepped outside into the bright sunlight, he knew this wasn't the end of his story. It was just the beginning.